T, and I'm on the Vancouver Startup Week team. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are grateful to be virtually gathered on Indigenous land, regardless of where you are joining us from. I'm grateful to be on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. I'm privileged to live, work, and play on these lands. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for VSW 2021, and welcome to the Global Force of JEDI for Startups, hosted by Smith Assembly. This session is also part of the VSW Founder Track and is proudly supported by Sage Accounting. Sage knows you didn't start your business from an accountant. Sorry to any accountants out there. But Sage Accounting keeps your business organized and running smoothly, track your cash flow, send out invoices, and get paid quickly. So you can visit the Sage Accounting booth to access free guides and templates for starting your business finances the right way. Plus, get an exclusive VSW discount if you're ready to switch from Excel. During the session, if you have any questions for our speakers, please post them in the Q&A in the Whova session. You can also upvote your questions. But for now, I'll pass the mic over to the team and we'll begin.
My name is Liz, and the pronouns are she and her, and I too am super grateful to be living and working and playing on the lands of the Coast Salish people. And I am the co-founder of Smith Assembly, and joining me today,
Hi, I'm Corrales. I'm super excited to be here today to speak a little bit more about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and what that means for startups.
So now we are going to share a presentation, and we are thrilled to gather with y'all today to talk about the global force of JEDI, and it is a it stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And one of the reasons we love using this term is because it is related to the movies and the whole universe of Star Wars. It is a force that can be used for good, and we encourage you through this conversation to learn more about it. Our agenda today is, we're going to start off just with a little bit of context about who we are and why we feel we have some experience around JEDI and startups. Then move into an overview of those terms and explain why we feel it's relevant for you today in startups. And then move into a discussion of a global case study, which you are going to help us choose through the poll. Ta and I really want this to be a very workshop, and so if you can put things in the chat, put things into the Q&A functionality, we want to hear from you, and we want to hear what questions you have. So Ta and I have an interesting background. We met in Botswana a few years ago while we were co-organizing an international development summit. Ta and I have completely different backgrounds. We're different ages. She's from Costa Rica, I'm from the United States, but we both have a passionate interest in radical inclusion and equality. And so as we formed our company, right at the beginning of the pandemic, we spent a lot of time, as you'll see in our timeline, we spent a lot of time remotely. Ta is actually 7,000 miles away from me. I am in Vancouver, she's in Heredia. And we have differing experience on the startup side as well. So I am a multi-time startup person. This is my third founding team, and about my 10th startup actually over the years. And Ta, do you want to talk a little bit about yours?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually really great to be here and to be able to share a little bit of our journey with you all. I think one of the most important things that Liz and I share is this passion for bringing to life inclusive businesses and also just inclusive products. So that's a little bit of what we want to share today, even though we are actually super different, like Liz said.
So JEDI as a topic is incredibly relevant for startups. As you can see on the next slide, it applies in a lot of different situations. So we believe it's important whether you are focusing on a social impact or not, whether you're just starting a company or trying to grow and scale a company. It's certainly incredibly important when you're hiring and retaining your staff, from the earliest co-founding teams to the 100th employee. When you work with suppliers, when you create products or services, these lenses of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion are incredibly helpful. And certainly if you're seeking B Corp certification or trying to go public, you definitely want to be considering these things because they're critical to success.
And we wanted to begin by explaining these concepts. What does JEDI mean? What does justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion mean? And how do they interrelate with each other? Thanks to the most recent conversations that I think at this point we have all had around these topics, there are now many, many terms we have heard our friends talk about, that we have heard in our workplace. And so what we wanted to do with this workshop was bring some more clarity to these terms, specifically for startups. And also we want to share with you all some of the examples of how these terms apply to, real case studies, real scenarios that we're gonna share with you from different places around the world. I would like to start by defining diversity. So what does diversity mean? Diversity refers to the variety of different demographics, identities, and conditions that exist within a group of individuals. And so that means that no single individual is diverse, but actually diversity is what happens within groups. And each of those differences that people have contribute to an individual's experience of privilege and or oppression. In one really, really important term here too is intersectionality. Intersectionality refers to how, as humans, each and every one of us has a specific set of conditions, and those conditions affect our experiences of privilege and of oppression. So, for example, myself, I'm a woman, and I'm a person of color, and I have experienced oppression because of that. But I've also experienced privilege because I come from an educational background with a highly credentialed university. So each and every one of us has a different experience, and the importance of intersectionality is really recognizing that no single condition is gonna impact our lives, but the complexity of them all.
So moving to the next slide, then we have some interesting statistics for you, and we would love to get your guesses. So I have a couple of question marks in there. Can we get some people putting things into the chat? What percentage do you think US and European founders are who are white? And then a second question, what percentage do you think of investments went to female-only founded startups in 2019? Can we get a few guesses? While we're gathering guesses, you can see here that according to Glassdoor, it's incredibly important to this next round of employees, 76% in fact, who really want to have a diverse and inclusive workplace. And companies who are in the top quartile of gender diversity on their boards are nearly 30% more likely than their peers to outperform financially. So Kathy's got some guesses. We've got 80% of white founders. Let's see, 20% of investments. Thank you, Kathy. Frida says 90% and 7. So we'll go to the next slide. You can see that you were close, yes. So around 77% of founders in the US are white or Caucasian. The share is a little higher in Europe. As you can see, it's up to 84. And shockingly, only 3% of the investments went to female-only founded startups in 2019, which is down from the previous year. I wasn't able to find the number from 2020, but I've heard that there are similar problems happening now. So it's incredibly important to be diverse. So moving to the next slide, you can see that there's a number of different lenses in which you can apply diversity in your startup. You can be looking at founders and the leadership team, your employees, but also take a look at your board and advisors. There was a really good talk earlier today about how somebody is having a little bit of a challenge getting diversity into their team, but they've increased the diversity of the board and the advisors, and now they're starting to see a bit more traction. So take a look at your recent candidates, the hires, the promotions, and the departures. Are there any patterns related to all of those different intersectionalities of diversity that Tom mentioned? And other lenses you can look at are the way that you do feedback and recognition. So the kudos that you give, the bonuses and the raises, how are those distributed? Not just diversity in people, but diversity in roles and levels and things along those lines. So you can see here, there's a really powerful list of things that you can consider. So I'm really curious from folks out there, what are the best ways that your companies are supporting diversity right now? And in which ways do you think people should invest more in diversity? These listed items might give you guys some hints or some ideas, but I'm also curious to hear what folks are saying out there. So drop it into the chat because all of this helps us. Every team is different.
And now we want to talk a little bit more about inclusion. So, okay, say you have a diverse team, you know your numbers. What can you do to make sure that each and every one individual that is part of your team feels welcome and feels engaged and feels like they belong in that space? And so that's exactly what inclusion is about. It's about each person making intentional choices to engage and embrace the full spectrum of diversity within their groups. And now Liz is going to share with us a little bit more interesting stats.
So this is another question for y'all. I want you to take a guess. You can see here, I've got a couple of question marks. So if a business is in the top quarter of a rating where its employees are highly engaged, which is a reflection on inclusion, how much more profitable do you think that those businesses are than the ones in the bottom quartile? And how much more sales do you think that they have? Can we get some guesses out there? Frida, Caddy, got any for here? Anybody else? Okay, moving on to the next slide. I think we have a stumper talk. 21% more profitable and 20% higher sales. So there's a lot of studies out there that show that having a really powerful culture of inclusion is linked to employee engagement, and that employee engagement is critical for performance and retention and productivity. Moving on to the next slide. So here's a similar thought experiment. How inclusive is your brand, your vision, and your mission? Think about that intersectionality that Todd mentioned. How inclusive is your workplace culture, whether it's in person right now, a hybrid scenario, or if it's all remote and online? How inclusive is the office? Think about the physicality of the office. Taking a look at your compensation packages and benefits, your most recent meetings, the kinds of tools you use for whatever happens in your world, but almost everybody has communication and collaboration tools. And what kind of events or training programs does your company typically support? Obviously, you can also look at the inclusivity of your products and services. So this is a wonderful lens with which to take a look at and reflect on your own company. So again, a similar question to last time. Can we get any comments out there about the best ways that your company supports inclusion? What are ways you can inspire other people on this chat? In what ways should your company invest more in inclusion? Food for thought for later. Ty, you want to continue with the next one?
Sure. So now moving on to equity. Equity refers to basically the path towards equality. So if equality is our end goal, we got to apply some equity tools. So equity is basically allocating resources and opportunities in a way that addresses the relative privilege of oppression that different individuals or groups experience. So not everybody has the same access to opportunities, to resources, etc. And it's very important that we recognize that and that we also consider that when thinking of policies and many other considerations that Liz will talk a little bit more about.
Thanks, Todd. So yeah, equity is a really wonderful way to be thinking. So as you can see in the next slide, that one interesting statistic in healthcare actually is that 70% of the global workforce in healthcare are women, but yet only 25% hold senior roles. I think there was a recent article that came out today or yesterday about taking a look at the United States government and seeing that, 30% of the US population is white men, but they hold 60% of the leadership roles in the government. There were some interesting experiments that have happened over the years with regards to resumes. And so this really is important for us as we're taking a look at our startup team pipelines and making sure that our recruiting processes are equitable because we definitely don't want to exclude anybody who can add to our culture. So moving on to the next slide. Another list for you, another way to think about things. So you can see that there's some similarities between this list. There's some points that you can think about from a lens of diversity, inclusion, or equity, but then there are also some unique things in here. And so you can be taking a look at your company structure, the leadership hierarchy, the decision-making processes themselves. We've already talked about recruiting and hiring, but from machine learning standpoint, what kinds of data sources and models are you using, or are you relying upon that you're sourcing from some external company? And of course, as you're looking for your company to have a social impact or to have a corporate social responsibility program, what kinds of ways can you make them more equitable? So I want you to be thinking about a similar question that we asked before, like what is your company doing to support equity? And in what ways should you invest more in equity? And you can be thinking about all of these questions for diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice from the lens of your role as an employee or a leader in a startup or even a larger company. Ty, you want to take it away for the last one?
Sure. Okay, so the last term that we wanted to explore was justice. Justice is a relatively new addition to the conversation. Often we hear about EDI, but today we're talking about JEDI because justice refers to how we can break down some of the barriers that currently exist in our institutions, in our society, that are preventing different individuals and groups from having equitable access to the resources and opportunities that they need to live well on their own terms. So basically, justice is looking at things a little bit more from a, you can say we're zooming out here, looking at things from an institutional perspective and structural perspective, a systems perspective, and thinking about how we can make our spaces more equitable.
So there's some really interesting statistics related to justice as well. So social justice in particular is one of the variables that most strongly predicts happiness on a national scale. And so countries that place a greater emphasis on social justice are helping the psychological well-being of its residents, because they feel like they matter not just to their small personal communities, but to their larger communities and to the country as a whole. There was a really wonderful article in HBR last year where it talked about some do's and don'ts. And so I'd love for y'all to take a look at these. But as you're thinking about JEDI in your workplace and ways that you can make your workplace more diverse and inclusive and equitable and just, please, please don't place the burden for these kinds of movements and changes and suggestions on your employees of color or on your women. So take a look at the makeup of whoever's helping you out in that respect. If they're all women, if they're all people of color, if they're all coming from a different kind of community that is not part of the dominant culture in your particular ecosystem, then find ways of sharing that burden, of sharing that load, and involving more actively everybody else in the organization. So now's like a perfect time for white people in particular to step up. And this can be a really overwhelming thing. As Todd talked about at the beginning in that slide that showed, 50 different words and all of these different topics, there's a lot to think about. And you don't have to consider all of it at once. You probably should not consider it all at once. So find ways of breaking things down into concrete goals. You've heard of SMART goals. Really try to involve your team and your leadership team in figuring out what the consensus is on what you should prioritize and focus on first. And really use design thinking to help with that. Next slide. So a similar list of thought experiments for your enjoyment. How just is your brand, values, and mission? Your products and services, the impact that you have on a daily basis on your staff, your supply chain, your customers, and the larger community in which you exist. And how just is your impact on the world? You can think about that from a climate perspective, from a social justice perspective. There's a lot of different ways. So we encourage you to take some time and talk amongst yourselves and think for yourselves, how could you bring more JEDI into your workplace? So we have a poll and not many people have voted yet. So I would love for you to take a look at the poll. We have a chance to talk about some global case studies. As you can see here, we have 8 possibilities. We're not going to talk about all of them, but we are going to talk about one for sure. And if we have time or interest, we might talk about a second. So which one should we talk about? The poll gives you an opportunity to vote. And we do have 2 votes so far. And food equity, berries, and the Triqui people seem to be winning. So what do y'all think? You can put it into the chat too if the poll doesn't work for you. Which of these 8 case studies would you like to hear? Otherwise, we are going to move into food equity, berries, and the Triqui people. Going once. Going twice. I think we might have a winner.
Wonderful. Great. And I'm so happy we're going to talk a little bit more about this because we have heard, Liz and I, a couple of times now that food equity is something that we don't often think about. And it's actually incredible to see, especially now in this globalized world, how we are all connected and our food connects us too. So what we really want to explore in this case study is equity and what that means for basically the food that we eat on a day-to-day basis. Small scale farmers, so basically farmers that have 1 hectare or less, produce over 70% of the world's food. And what's crazy about that, the crazy part is that these same small scale farmers are also the ones who are suffering from lack of access to food themselves. So food equity is this concept that talks about how we can all have the ability and the opportunity to grow and to consume healthy, affordable, and also culturally significant foods. And so in an ideal world, in an equitable food system, each community member is able to grow and procure and trade and sell and eat and dispose their food in a manner that prioritizes their own culture, that enables equitable access to land, that also considers fair and equitable prices and wages, health, that thinks about our human health, and also that thinks about the environment. So thinking about ecological sustainability too. And the specific story that we wanted to share with you all comes from this wonderful book by Seth Holmes, um, that's called Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies. If you haven't had the chance to read it, I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful piece of ethnographic work that also includes Seth Holmes' view as a physician uh, on the work that the Triqui people do in Skagit Valley in the United States, uh, and how their experience as migrant farm workers responds to actually a very unequitable food system that we have. Um, the Triqui people are an indigenous group of Oaxaca, Mexico. Oaxaca is a state in the southern part of Mexico and is an incredibly diverse state. It has over a dozen different indigenous groups that live within it. And the Triqui people specifically have been a group with a history of actually being displaced from their land in Oaxaca by another dominant group. And they currently, they have many needs. The land that they now live in has suffered from a lot of violence, institutional violence, among other things. And all of this conflict has pushed many people to migrate north to be able to sustain their families. And most often they find work as farm workers. And this type of work specifically that they do is very hard physically. Uh, Many of them, after years of working up north, come back to their hometowns in Oaxaca and in Mexico with very severe um, problems, health problems caused by their work in the farmlands. And even though they actually, they're from their wages, they pay taxes, they can't benefit from the health system uh, in the United States as illegal workers. And so because of this, a lot of there is a lot of violence that occurs within the berries industry and ecosystem. And what is really interesting, though, about this book is that it also talks about not only the perspective of the farm workers, but also institutional and structural issues that cause many of the farm owners to not be able to pay more than the wages that they currently pay, because there are pressures within market systems to bring their prices down. And so what we wanted to think about here is that there's several forces in play when we think about equitable systems. There are very complex social dynamics around them too, and that we got to think about each and every one of those forces to start to think about how to address them, right? Another very important piece of information that is actually quite interesting is the fact that racial inequalities are perpetuated often in farm systems. And what do I mean with that? Uh, there are different types of different ethnicities, of course, within Mexico, which cause different people to have access to different types of work within the farm. So often, indigenous people who do not speak the Spanish language, and many of the Triqui people do not speak the Spanish language, are unable to have jobs within the farm that are a little bit higher up. So they are not able to become managers because they don't speak Spanish. They're not able to access many other resources because of the language barrier. Whereas mestizo Mexicans or Mexicans who speak Spanish independently of their ethnicity are able to do that. And often even skin color plays a role. So for example, lighter skinned um, farm workers are more likely to become a manager or a supervisor in the farms than darker skinned workers. And so this is another consideration we have to think about when thinking about the intersectionality of people and how different conditions, languages, race affects our work. Um, and I'm gonna stop there. There's a lot more interesting information about this, but I actually wanna go and talk a little bit about some of the work that locals are doing in Oaxaca and in the Triqui regions to address some of these inequities that they have seen in their own communities. And this specific work is done by an NGO called WACCIN, the Oaxacan Innovation Center. And they're currently working on bringing some innovative farming processes to the Triqui region such that people can start to produce in their own land. Especially with the pandemic in the past couple of years, it's become very hard for the locals to procure food, which they often bought uh, in a nearby market that came from other locations. And so they've been doing some great work about how to produce their own food locally and also how to produce specifically more nutritious food, which is just great. And we just wanted to highlight it and say that one of the really wonderful things about this work is the work that the communities themselves are doing in order to improve their situation, right? And I'm gonna leave it there. Liz, I'm not sure if anybody has any questions or any thoughts about this specific case study that they wanted to share. Feel free to use the chat for that.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. I love hearing these global case studies because I feel sometimes it's easier to think about these complex topics when you have like a greater breadth of examples, and sometimes it's easier to think about somebody else's situation and then look at yourself and look at your own company. And sometimes by thinking about those other cases, you're able to see patterns that can apply to your own world. And so thanks for sharing about the Triqui people. When I lived in Oaxaca, as you know, I had an opportunity to meet some folks in the community, and I have not thought about berries the same way since. So I still haven't yet had an opportunity to read that book, but I'm looking forward to it. So one thing that in my mind really applies from this case study into the startup, or at least the corporate world, is taking a look at your workforce from a temp worker perspective to the full-time worker. And so you can be thinking of Amazon, Google, most of the big five have this discrepancy between folks who are completely priceless, because without the people in the kitchens and without people in operations and a variety of other logistics, the office wouldn't function. The other employees who might be more knowledge workers, wouldn't have that support structure in place that they do. So Todd, do you have any thoughts about ways you can translate some of the lessons learned from this case study into a corporate or startup environment?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of things that I think are super important here. The first one is to really think about equitable ways in which we can build our startups from the ground up. So one just simple example for that is what Liz just said. Like, what happens when you hire different types of people for the different types of work that you need? Are there ways in which you can ensure right from the beginning that these people are being respected? One of the things I can think of is, so for example, if are there ways in which you can ensure to support that any IP or any knowledge that comes from, specifically this applies to more like the cultural startups, that comes from indigenous groups remains theirs, and they see the benefits of their work in not only, you know, respect, but also, for example, if there are financial benefits related to that, are they seeing them as well? And one of the really like big opportunities for me for a startup is that you can actually create your own processes, right? If you're still flexible, etc., you can figure out how to include more equitable policies right from the beginning.
Super. So one question that we had in the chat, Ta, is about other resources we might be able to share for people who would like to learn more about food equity in particular. I already put in the book, Fresh Food Broken Bodies, but is there anything else we should add?
I can't think of anything right now, but if you want to reach out to me and send me an email, I'll be happy to follow up and send some more resources and start a conversation. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question.
Super. And I think we have time for one more case study. So if anybody wants to put into the chat which case study they would like, you can see on the screen the other 7, any of which we could talk about. And they're all equally fascinating. So, so you can put in the chat or answer in the poll. Otherwise, perhaps we will talk about racial diversity, intersectionality in Mexico. Yeah, let's go with that one, Todd. And it's really cool because it kind of blends in very nicely with what you were just talking about.
Wonderful. Yeah. I love this case study too, exactly because it follows up a little bit on one we just talked about. It builds up. So this photo that you can see right here, this wonderful, beautiful town is called Yosoyusi, and it's a beautiful indigenous town in the Mixteca Sierra of Oaxaca. And if you grew up here, you most likely grew up speaking an indigenous language. And a crazy fact that comes from an Oxfam report that I'm going to talk about a little bit more is that if you are a girl in Mexico who speaks an indigenous language, you are 4 times less likely to finish primary school that in comparison to girls who don't speak an indigenous language. So basically who speak Spanish. And this fact that I just mentioned comes from a study by Oxfam, which is called Inequality Will Speak for My Race. And what's interesting about it is that it quantifies the impact of different ethno-racial characteristics of inequality on the inequality of opportunities in Mexico. And what I love about it and that I found profoundly valuable is that it uses a multi-dimensional lens and is based on data, completely based on data. And so it gives us a tool to understand from a numbers perspective to what intersectionality means. And it specifically considers 3 ethno-racial characteristics, which are linguistic context, so what language do you speak, ethno-racial self-identification, and skin tone, and how each of those 3 characteristics impact the 3 socioeconomic dimensions, which are education, occupation, and material wealth. And basically, this study was created to ask a few different questions. First, to what extent do those ethno-racial characteristics contribute to the inequality of opportunities in Mexico? Second, what are the effects of different ethno-racial characteristics like linguistic self-identification, etc., on the educational, occupational, and economic destinations of people? So basically, how where you end up relates to how you look like or what languages do you speak, and to what extent are the effects of those ethno-racial characteristics explained by the accumulation of disadvantages, or are they actually a result of current practices of discrimination and others that occur today? And this is a really interesting question because it explores, Mexico has a history of colonization. And of course, there are many disadvantages that have been accumulated historically. But is there also stuff happening today that is affecting people? And how can we fight that? And the results, what happened when they did this study, the results made it very evident that there are massive gaps in opportunities for people who speak indigenous languages, for people who have darker skin tones, and people who self-identify as indigenous or Afro-Mexican. And it shows that they have a statistically significant disadvantage, lower probabilities of advancing in the educational system, progressing in the workplace, or moving to the top of the wealth distribution, and even more so if they are women. So this speaks a lot for intersectionality, because it looks at what happens if you're an Afro-Mexican woman, what happens if you're an indigenous woman who speaks an indigenous language. And some of the results, this is a very extensive study, but I just wanted to bring up a couple of numbers for you to have a general idea. Is 43% more likely for a woman of a lighter skin tone to get a well-paid job in comparison to a woman of a darker skin complexion. 65% of people who speak an indigenous language self-identify as indigenous, and more than a third of this group doesn't self-identify with being indigenous. And another number, in comparison to mestizo Mexicans, if you're indigenous and speak an indigenous language, you are 231% more likely to be part of the poorest quintile of the population. So basically, well, first, it's easier to progress in the workplace if you are a lighter skinned Mexican. And second, many indigenous Mexicans still suffer from shame and don't recognize themselves. Why? Because of many complex reasons. But there was a very big disadvantage that was perceived if somebody spoke indigenous languages. And so many in other generations, people tried for their children to speak more Spanish because that would give them a greater advantage later in life. And that is something that many local groups and many wonderful people are working on. How can we work towards more equity that doesn't make for indigenous speaking people? How can we prevent them from the disadvantages that speaking those indigenous languages imply? And so basically, as I said, for all of the groups examined, for everything, being lighter and not speaking indigenous language provides you with greater advantages. And this was a very important and really big study because I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Latin America or have been or have talked about racism in Latin America, but many people said that it didn't exist, that it, currently it didn't happen. And these numbers are able to show that it does happen and it continues to happen. And so it becomes a tool to actually address some of these issues? How can we strive towards more equitable hiring practices? How can we make sure that the biases that we have during the hiring process don't affect the final decision? We all have implicit biases, stuff that we don't realize that affects our perceptions of how skilled somebody is, etc. And so once we know what the problem is, like this study did, it is easier for us to think of ways to examine our own processes and our own practices and try to improve them.
Yeah, that's incredibly powerful, Todd. Thank you for sharing. And you can see the connection between this case study and the one before about berries and the Triqui people. But you can also think about this case study, as Todd mentioned earlier, giving some credibility and some numbers behind the impact of intersectionality on the experiences of folks. And so you've seen in some of the stats that we've shown, and you've probably read how women of color have a harder time than white women in, say, a corporate environment in terms of either representation, certainly about pay, and a lot of pushback, in the culture that is very much dominated by white men. And this is something that we hope to help change. So we're curious out there in the Whova world. Do you have any questions or comments? How have these case studies resonated with you? Feel free to drop things in the chat, put things into the Q&A. You can ask questions anytime, but for now, perhaps Todd will move on to the next section. Super. So we wanted to talk a little bit about practical tips for building an inclusive high-performance team. And so as we go along, we'll be sharing some thoughts from our perspective, but we also want to hear from you, and the wisdom of the crowd is really powerful. So a question that I'll toss out there now in case you need some time to think about it is, what's the most important thing a manager or an executive can do to build this kind of culture in their team? And so moving to the next slide, our first tip is that leaders should really foster a sense of transparency and provide an environment that encourages support between not only them and the people in their teams, but also within people in the team. It's my experience after nearly 25 years of experience in corporate America that I and high-performing people do their best work when they're given the context that they need to do their work, when they have access to whatever information and resources they might need. And this could be documentation, this could be people, this could be getting timely feedback. But anything that you can do as an individual contributor or as a leader in your team or in your company to foster those connections between people so that they can have support, that there's a lot of transparency about what's going on, is going to pay big dividends later. So moving on to tip number 2. When people understand how what they're working on fits into the bigger picture, it makes them much more engaged with what they're doing and much more able to make solid decisions that respect not just their work, but the work as a whole. So anything that you can do to help your team members see those connections, and not just that like your number adds up to this number, but really talk about how the work of various people interplays together. When you give your work on time, this allows so-and-so to do this. And when you provide feedback, it allows this other person to do this. And all together, y'all need this. And then it moves to the next group. And then this is how it benefits our mission, our vision as a team and as a company. It's an incredibly powerful way to motivate people, and it also increases people's performance. Moving on to number 3. Give feedback. When things are happening in real time, it really helps to reinforce what's working well. If somebody did something or responded in a way that really aligns with your company's values and culture, give a shout out, give some props live in the moment. If there's constructive feedback for somebody, do give it in real time, not in that moment, as an aside in private, but make sure that the timing of this feedback is really responsive to the moment. Don't wait a week until your next one-on-one. Send them a quick note or pop something into Slack. When you tell people individually in private, or when you tell people individually or as a group in public, when you're giving those kinds of kudos, it really creates a wonderful environment into work. And then everybody sees how everybody else's contributions are valued. And if you're applying that JEDI lens, then you're going to give kudos to, people that might not normally get recognized and show how their work contributes to other people doing their work. Moving on to the next. Invest in your team in whatever way makes sense for your team. Sometimes this is about morale or team building events, which can foster feelings of connection, really strengthen relationships and increase engagement. And as you'll recall, that engagement level is really what drives performance. Whatever kind of training or development programs that your company offers, encourage your folks to participate in those. And if they're not as diverse and inclusive as they need to be, find ways of making your own or modifying those learning opportunities for everybody. People who feel like they're invested in often will turn around and put their best work and invest back in the company, but it's a two-way street. I'd really like to emphasize asking for suggestions. And the reason for this is that seeking the input of your team, and the ecosystem at large for what's working well, what could be improved, is incredibly important, because not only are you going to get ideas that you might not otherwise have had, but people are going to feel more involved. They're going to, have a lot more buy-in and passion for what they're doing. If there are any kind of challenges in your current culture or the current situation, sometimes an anonymous survey can be a great way of getting that more robustly direct feedback from folks. So whatever you need to do in order to just gather feedback, and it could be something as lightweight as asking a quick question on Slack, like, hey, how are y'all feeling? Do we need another gathering, a lunch and learn, a happy hour? Or, could it be, like, hey, is this team tool working for us or not? But do regularly ask for suggestions. It's kind of the concept of a 360 feedback, but more frequent. We mentioned this a little bit earlier, but the idea of design thinking, which is a cyclical, iterative process that allows you to break very complex problems down into simpler components. And when you have simple steps and you work through a process, and there's a lot of them out there, we have one on our blog. Design companies like Frog and IDEO make them widely available. Other folks do as well. You can work through these design thinking cycles, and you can really get the most amazing solutions, especially if you increase the diversity of the sources that you put into this process. So, look at different avenues of research, talk to more people, talk to different kinds of people, and everything that you can do to increase the diversity of the inputs into this cycle and increase the iterations of the number of cycles themselves. You're going to have more and more inclusive and robust solutions. And I'd like to remind everybody that the pandemic is not over, especially in other countries. So, in Canada and the US, finally, Canada is reaching parity and in some ways exceeding the vaccination rates and slowing the curve on the pandemic. But a lot of folks like Ta and a lot of our friends are living in places where the pandemic is not even remotely contained, and vaccines are not obviously in the immediate horizon. And even when you're in the US or Canada, this has been a traumatic year and a half for people, and everybody's experiencing it differently through their own unique lens. And so be kind to yourself, because you too have been experiencing it, but be kind to each other and do what you can to support everyone where they are. because as we start to reintegrate and we start to go back in person and things start to accelerate, some folks, including to a certain extent myself, are not ready to jump fully back into everything without, a little bit of thought and a little bit of self-care. So this comes to the end of our tips. We've got about 5 minutes left for questions. And we would love to hear from you. We don't see anything quite yet on the Q&A or the chat, but how are things for you? What suggestions do you have? What's your number one tip for building an inclusive high performance team? How do you use JEDI?
Thanks for the great talk. Something that I'm sure our audience would love to learn more about is what are some resources that they can read about or access afterwards, so they can continue to learn and bring that into their workplace and personal life.
I just put something into a chat. So we do have a gift for you. You'll see here that there's a short link to a resource list. It's a PDF, and it's got a lot of different links to some really cool work out there by a wide variety of people, looking at the lens of JEDI in each one of them. And it's really interesting stuff. So we hope you will download it. And if you enjoy it, drop us a note. Let us know how it goes. If you have a suggestion of something we could add to it, we'd love to hear it. We're always trying to learn new things.
Awesome. Thanks for that.
Yeah, and I just want to take a moment to say thank you everybody for being here, for listening to all of the awesome tips that Liz shared, but also for listening to our stories. We think that some of the most interesting insights come from stories, and that's why we like to share many stories from our friends, our collaborators, and our partners from around the world. So thank you, and I hope this was helpful for y'all.